He died last year, so who's wearing the butler's face? Welcome to Silent Case Files. I'm Pendleton. Comment your city. I love hearing from you. It was on one of those sullen February mornings, the sort that wraps London in a shroud of leaden cloud and a silence broken only by the rhythmic clip of horse hooves on wet cobblestone, that Sherlock Holmes, with the precise air of a man who knew he was about to be amused, tossed aside the Times and stared fixedly at the door. "You will observe," he said, folding his long fingers beneath his chin, "that our visitor is not the man he claims to be." I, who had been contentedly reading a medical journal by the fire in our Baker Street lodgings, glanced up. "There is no visitor," I said. Holmes smiled faintly. "And yet the boots upon the step have never trodden city streets. They carry a faint dust of loam, fresh, not more than a day old. Surrey, I should think." He paused just now to adjust his right glove. An ungloved hand would not tremble so unless it was accustomed to hiding its nerves. Moments later, as if summoned by Holmes's deductions alone, a sharp knock rattled the door. Mrs. Hudson admitted a lean, pale gentleman with a distinguished air and a countenance marred by anxiety. He moved with the restrained grace of someone trained in discretion, what Holmes would call the professional caution of a manservant who knows too much. "I believe you are Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked, his voice wavering. "My friend here is Dr. Watson," Holmes replied, gesturing to me. "And yes, I am Holmes. Please sit down, Mr. Ellis? Jonathan Ellis?" Holmes inclined his head. "Your occupation, Mr. Ellis?" I am, or rather was, the butler to the late Sir Reginald Marchmont of Ormond Square." Holmes's eyes flashed. "Late? Then I presume your master is deceased?" Ellis nodded stiffly. "Found dead 2 days ago in his study, sir. They say it was his heart, but I cannot believe it. There were irregularities." At this, Holmes rose and poured 3 cups of coffee, handing one to the man and one to me. "Tell me everything," he said. "From the beginning, if you please." Ellis took the cup with trembling hands. "It began 6 months ago, sir. Sir Reginald had grown increasingly secretive. Often he would disappear into his study for hours on end. He dismissed 2 footmen without reason and replaced them with strangers. There were late-night visitors, always men, and locked drawers that no one was allowed to touch." I scribbled notes furiously as he spoke. "And his death?" "He was found slumped at his desk, pen in hand, the inkwell overturned. No letter, no warning. The family physician declared it heart failure." Holmes's brow furrowed. "And what makes you doubt this conclusion?" "The study was disturbed, sir. Subtly so. A smudge on the carpet near the window, a missing candlestick. And his signet ring was gone."
"He never removed it, not even in sleep." Holmes leaned back, fingers steepled. "You say you were his butler, yet you seem more invested than one might expect." Ellis's eyes flickered. "Sir Reginald, he was more than a master to me. He saved me once, years ago. I owe him everything." Holmes regarded him for a moment. "One final question, Mr. Ellis. Did Sir Reginald have any enemies?" Ellis hesitated. "Not that I know of, sir. But there was a man who visited twice this past fortnight. Dark coat, limp in his left leg. Sir Reginald refused to see him the second time. They argued. I overheard a name. Havisham." At this, Holmes's eyes narrowed, and a strange intensity settled over him. "I believe we shall visit Ormond Square, Watson," he said, rising. "There is more to this butler's tale than service and loyalty. Much more. And if I'm not mistaken, we are already dealing with a man who has lived 2 lives, one in the drawing-room and one very much in the shadows." I felt the thrill that always accompanied the start of one of Holmes's cases, though I could scarcely have imagined how entangled this particular web would become. Holmes was uncharacteristically silent, as we made our way through the damp streets of London, the cab rattling through thickening fog that curled like smoke around the gas lamps. He sat with his chin tucked into the folds of his coat, eyes half-lidded in thought, fingers drumming a light rhythm against the frame of the window. "Does the name Havisham mean something to you?" I asked at last, unable to tolerate the silence any longer. Holmes did not look up. "A footnote in a forgery case some years ago. If memory serves, a Colonel Henry Havisham was involved in a minor scandal concerning embezzled funds and an unsigned will. Nothing grand, but the man disappeared before he could be arrested. Resurfaced once in Naples under another name, then vanished again. That was 7 years ago. And you think it's the same man? I think we should never underestimate the persistence of people who reinvent themselves. Ellis may have offered us more than he realizes." The cab drew up before a handsome townhouse in Ormond Square, its pale stone facade sullied by soot and drizzle. A black wreath still hung on the door. A footman admitted us after Ellis's name was given, and we were ushered directly into the late Sir Reginald's study, a chamber of dark wood panels, thick rugs, and an overwhelming hush that seemed to press in on all sides. Holmes paused on the threshold, nose lifted slightly as if sniffing the air. "Curious," he murmured. "There's been an attempt to reorder the room." "How can you tell?" I whispered. He merely gestured toward the fireplace. "The ash on the hearth has been brushed, but not well. There's a patch on the edge where soot was hastily cleared. Something was burned here, something larger than a sheet of paper. Look, there, Watson. The iron poker is still faintly scorched." I stepped closer. Indeed, the tip of the poker showed signs of recent use. Holmes crouched beside it, examining the hearthstone. Then he turned to the desk. The surface had been tidied, the ink blotter neatly aligned and the drawers closed, but there was an oddness to it, something in its unnatural precision. Holmes opened each drawer carefully, noting contents, but disturbing nothing. "There's a gap," he said suddenly, tapping the velvet-lined interior of the centre drawer. "A ring box might have lain here. Ellis was right. Sir Reginald's signet ring is missing." "Could it not have been taken by whoever found the body?" I offered. Holmes gave me a look over one shoulder. "And invite suspicion by removing the one item most easily traced? No, Watson, this was a deliberate removal, but by whom and why?" He stood suddenly and crossed to the window. "You see here," he said, pointing to the sill, "a smear of dark earth, just a trace, but enough to say someone either entered or left via this very window. The garden beneath is accessible from the alley, an odd method for someone presumably within the household." I bent and looked for myself. Holmes was right. Someone had used the window, not recently, but recently enough to leave a mark. A soft knock at the door interrupted us. A pale woman in mourning attire entered, the widow, we presumed. "Forgive me," she said, voice trembling. "You must be Mr. Holmes. I am Eleanor Marchmont." Holmes bowed his head slightly. "My condolences, Lady Marchmont. I hope we are not intruding at too difficult a time." "You are most welcome, sir. Jonathan Ellis told me of your visit. He is a trusted man. Reginald valued his judgment." She hesitated, her eyes falling to the rug as if it held some private memory. "I have tried to make sense of this," she went on. "The doctors were so certain. But my husband was not a fragile man. He had the constitution of a foxhound, and yet he was troubled recently. Something weighed on him." "Troubled in what way?" Holmes asked gently. She drew in a breath. "He began locking the study door even when he was inside. He insisted on writing letters late into the night. And he stopped wearing his ring." said it felt like a promise he had broken. I didn't understand. Holmes's eyes flickered at that. Do you know if Sir Reginald had any recent dealings with a man named Havisham? She froze. Her face paled further. Henry Havisham? Yes. Yes, he came to the house twice. The first time Reginald received him, and they argued for nearly an hour. I wasn't told what it was about, but the second time Reginald refused to see him. He sent word that the matter was closed. And that was how recently? 4 days before his death. Holmes nodded once. Did your husband keep correspondence? She gestured to a bureau in the corner. He was meticulous with his letters, filed everything, but I haven't gone through them. I couldn't bear to. Holmes crossed swiftly to the bureau, scanning the labels. After a moment he drew out a thin folder marked H correspondence. He opened it and rifled through quickly, then stopped. Here, he said. 1 letter, handwritten, no return address, dated just 5 days ago. He handed it to me and I read aloud. Reginald, I will not be buried alone while you prosper on our shared sin. You took the life I might have had. You took the name. Return what is mine, or I will come for it. H. Lady Marchmont gasped, hand flying to her throat. Holmes folded the letter. A threat, he said, but one made with more than vengeance in mind. There's personal grievance here, something between them, deep and old. He turned back to her. May I ask? Was there ever any hint that Sir Reginald had a brother, a distant cousin perhaps? Lady Marchmont shook her head. None. Reginald was an only child. At least, I thought he was. Holmes paced a moment, then turned to me with that sharp glint in his eye, the look he wore when the game had truly begun. Watson, I believe the time has come for us to visit the Marchmont family solicitor. If there is any truth in this letter, and I believe there is, it will be written not in ink, but in inheritance. We took our leave of Lady Marchmont, who appeared even more shaken now than when we'd arrived. As we stepped into the grey afternoon, the wind sharp against our cheeks, Holmes pulled up his collar. A man who reinvents himself always leaves something behind, he muttered. Let us hope Mr. Ellis was not the only one paying attention. And with that, we disappeared once more into the London fog. The offices of Cranley and Dawes, solicitors to the Marchmont family, for nearly 4 decades, occupied a discreet corner of Lincoln's Inn Fields, the brass plate on the door polished to a dull gleam that spoke of quiet respectability. Holmes and I were received promptly by Mr. Samuel Dawes, a meticulous gentleman with pale whiskers, pince-nez glasses, and an expression that suggested the truth, once recorded, could never be entirely inconvenient. After the usual formalities, Holmes wasted no time. Mr. Dawes, we are investigating certain matters surrounding the death of Sir Reginald Marchmont. I presume you are familiar with the particulars of his estate and family? Indeed, Mr. Holmes, I had the honour of drawing up Sir Reginald's will some 3 years ago and have overseen his financial matters for longer still. A tragic loss. Though sudden, the physicians were not entirely surprised, given his history of elevated blood pressure. Holmes merely offered a faint smile. We're less concerned with medical opinion and more with historical fact. Specifically, we are pursuing a man who claims a long-standing grievance against Sir Reginald. The name Havisham means nothing to you. Dawes frowned, adjusted his glasses and leaned back in his chair. Havisham? No, I do not recall any such person appearing in the will or connected accounts, but let me be precise. He rose and retrieved a L-ed ledger from a cabinet, flipping through it with deliberate care. Here we are. The Marchmont estate is substantial, though straightforward. All lands and properties passed to Lady Eleanor, with certain annuities set aside for charitable causes, No unusual bequests, no mention of a Havisham. In fact, the only anomaly of note occurred nearly 20 years ago, when Sir Reginald requested the destruction of a prior draft of his will. It was never signed. Holmes leaned forward slightly. Might I inquire as to the nature of that earlier version? Dawes looked momentarily uncomfortable. It listed a beneficiary by the name of Henry M., no surname given. An allowance was to be provided annually, but the amount was modest, and there was no explanatory note. When Sir Reginald instructed me to destroy it, he said only that the man had forfeited any claim. Holmes glanced at me, and I felt the quiet snap of a puzzle piece falling into place. "Would you have kept a copy?" Holmes asked. "I keep records of all drafts, though only for my own protection. If you will wait a moment." Dawes left us briefly and returned with a yellowing carbon duplicate of the earlier will. Holmes read it carefully, then passed it to me. The clause in question was simple enough. To H.M. I bequeath a yearly allowance of $100 to be administered discreetly and without public record. That was struck out in the final version? Holmes asked. Yes, at Sir Reginald's insistence. Holmes stood, his energy returning with renewed clarity. "Thank you, Mr. Dawes. You've been most helpful. Tell me one final question. Did Sir Reginald ever mention a family connection, however distant, that might have brought shame or trouble upon his name?" Dawes hesitated, then said, "There was once a rumour, nothing formal. In his younger days, Sir Reginald spent some time in India before inheriting the Marchmont title. There was talk of an indiscretion with a local woman, possibly a child born of that union. But Sir Reginald never acknowledged it, and no proof was ever produced." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "That, Mr. Dawes, is precisely the kind of proof someone like Henry Havisham might now wish to produce." Back on the street, Holmes lit a cigarette and walked in silence for several paces before speaking. "We are dealing with a case not of murder alone, Watson, but of long-buried identity. The motive is not money, it is restoration. A man denied his past returns to claim it, and when refused, he seeks retribution. But if he truly is Sir Reginald's illegitimate son, why not present his case legally? Why threaten? Why steal the—"
Ring, why? Holmes cut me off with a raised hand. "Because legality requires evidence, and our Mr. Havisham lacks it. Blood alone is insufficient in England's eyes, but symbolic possession like the signet ring or a burning of past documents, those are gestures of reclamation. He intends to erase Reginald's legacy and substitute his own." "And the candlestick? The missing item from the study?" "A weapon, I suspect. Perhaps to threaten, or perhaps more. We must confirm the true cause of death. Heart failure may only have been a convenient assumption." We returned to Baker Street, where Holmes immediately dispatched a telegram to the coroner requesting permission to examine the body. As we waited, he resumed his restless pacing, the fire hissing quietly in the grate. Hours passed before a knock brought a uniformed runner bearing a reply. Holmes tore it open and read aloud. "Permission granted under special provision. Body to be exhumed at once. Post-mortem supervised. Dr. Hastings in attendance. Immediate travel to Kensington mortuary advised." Within the hour we were there, and I confess the solemnity of that visit gripped me with unease. The post-mortem was already underway, and Dr. Hastings, a wiry man with alert eyes, looked up as we entered. "I understand you suspect foul play, Mr. Holmes?" "We seek clarity, that's all." Hastings nodded and peeled back the sheet. "No visible trauma, but here, beneath the collarbone, a faint contusion. Almost invisible, consistent with the edge of a heavy blunt object. Death was cardiac arrest, yes, but likely induced by sudden impact and shock. He was struck, hard enough to kill." Holmes's face was unreadable. And the time of death? Approximately between 11 and midnight. Holmes nodded slowly. Then we have our moment. The question becomes, who had access then? We emerged into the night, the fog coiling once more like a living thing. Holmes stopped just outside the gates and turned to me. Tomorrow we visit the two dismissed footmen. I suspect at least one of them knows precisely why he was sent away, and I must speak to Ellis again. There's something in his tale that I now find suspect. You doubt him? I doubt everyone, Watson. That is the price of logic. As we stepped into the night-bound cab, I saw Holmes's eyes glint with that fierce light that meant the truth was near. But not yet ours. By the time we returned to Baker Street, the city had retreated into silence beneath the gas lamps, and even the clatter of hooves seemed muffled by the persistent fog. Holmes shed his overcoat without comment and went directly to the side table where he jotted a brief note and rang for a messenger. As he handed off the envelope addressed to a certain James Tibbs, I waited by the hearth, eager yet wary. "You're sending for one of the dismissed footmen?" I asked. "Not quite," Holmes replied, pouring
himself a small brandy. James Tibbs is an informant of mine, formerly a pickpocket, now reformed to the modest extent that he sells secrets to me rather than to his former employers. I have asked him to locate the two dismissed servants from Marchmont House, Daniel Rook and Edward Chimes. Their abrupt departure, paired with the timing of Sir Reginald's behavioural change, is too neatly aligned to be dismissed as coincidence. And Ellis? We shall see him in the morning. His story still troubles me. There is a certain performance to it, the kind a man might give not when lying outright, but when concealing one uncomfortable truth behind another. We must tread carefully. I retired with more questions than answers, and awoke to find Holmes already dressed, a half-eaten breakfast untouched, beside a spread of notes on the desk. A telegram lay open. Rook located in Whitechapel, stays above cobblers on Shilling Street, Chimes unfound. Tibbs. We were soon rattling through the fog-bound streets again, the city's eastern quarter waking with a din of carts and hurrying men. Shilling Street was a narrow alley sunk deep in soot and weariness. Holmes paid the driver and strode ahead with his usual purpose, up a rickety stair to a crooked green door. Daniel Rook was a stout, nervous man with a mop of wiry hair and the complexion of someone not quite recovered from a run-in with hard drink. He blinked at us blearily, then turned a shade paler as Holmes introduced himself. "I don't know anything, sir," Rook began at once. "I swear it. I was let go, that's all. No fuss." "You were let go a month before Sir Reginald died," Holmes said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Why?" Rook hesitated. "Said I was careless, broke a decanter, but it weren't true. He was getting odd, see? Jumping at shadows, locking doors he never locked, always writing, talking to himself." Holmes took a slow step forward. "And was there ever a visitor, someone you were told not to mention? A man with a limp, perhaps?" Now Rook stiffened. His eyes darted. "I didn't see nothing." "You're lying," Holmes said softly. "And I believe you're afraid of the man who paid you to stay silent. But consider this, Sir Reginald is dead, and the law does not take kindly to those who obstruct murder investigations. Speak now, and you may yet be left in peace." Rook licked his lips. "There was a man, came after dark, twice, maybe 3 times. Always asked for Sir Reginald, never used his name. But I heard shouting once, real shouting. Ellis came in afterward looking pale, said to forget it." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Ellis said that?" "Yes, said Sir Reginald was fine and the gentleman had been dealt with." "And then?" "Week later I was dismissed." Holmes nodded. One final question. Did you ever see anything missing after the shouting? Anything out of place in the...
Study? Rook blinked. A drawer was open once, papers everywhere, and there was a box, small, dark wood, velvet inside. It disappeared. I figured someone nicked it, but I kept quiet. Holmes stepped back. You've done yourself some good today, Mr. Rook. I suggest you continue in that direction. We left him to his anxious solitude and made directly for Ellis's lodgings near the park, where the butler received us with the same restrained courtesy as before. But there was tension now behind his eyes, something taut and wary. Mr. Ellis, Holmes began, we've been to the solicitor, and we know of the man named only as H.M. in the earlier draft of the will. Would you care to tell us what you know of him? Ellis hesitated only a second too long. I told you, sir, I don't... Holmes raised a hand. Mr. Ellis, please. The facts are catching up. Sir Reginald did not die of natural causes, as you well know, and your decision to cover up signs of intrusion, burning something in the fireplace, wiping the hearth, can no longer be attributed to loyalty alone. So I ask again, who is Henry Havisham? Ellis's jaw tightened. Then quietly he said, he is Sir Reginald's son. There was silence. Not acknowledged, not legitimate, Ellis went on, but his nonetheless, conceived during Sir Reginald's posting in Madras. The mother died, the child, Henry, was raised in near poverty, but when he reached manhood he learned the truth, came to England, found Sir Reginald. And you knew all this? I asked, stunned. I did. Reginald confessed it to me. He felt guilt, yes, but also fear. Henry resented him bitterly. Said he'd been denied everything, a name, a future. Sir Reginald offered him a stipend, quietly. That was years ago. And recently, Holmes pressed, Henry demanded more, not just money, recognition, the right to inherit. Sir Reginald refused. There was shouting, yes. Henry struck him once. I thought it over then, but Reginald told me not to speak. Did Henry return again? Ellis nodded slowly. The night before his death, late. I let him in against my better judgment. I waited outside the study. I heard voices, low, tense, then a crash. When I entered, Henry was gone. Reginald looked pale, but alive. He said to leave it. I did. The next morning he was dead. Holmes's voice was soft, but fierce. You burned something that night, didn't you? Ellis's hands trembled. A letter. It bore Henry's name, a draft of an agreement, perhaps. I feared it would ruin Reginald's reputation. He was proud of his name. Holmes stared at him for a long moment. You may have destroyed a key piece of evidence, Mr. Ellis, and in doing so you may have emboldened a killer. Ellis bowed his head. I only wanted to protect the family. We'll see if that protection holds, Holmes said. Because if Henry Havisham is who I believe, he is. He's not finished yet. We left Ellis white-faced and trembling. Back on the street, I asked, what now? Holmes's voice was low, thoughtful. Now we find Henry Havisham, and we force him to make a mistake. He lit a cigarette, his eyes already calculating the next move. The fog closed around us once more. Holmes did not speak as we made our way back toward Baker Street. He walked with a purposeful stride, his eyes distant, his hands clasped behind his back. I had come to recognize that posture. His mind was ablaze, fitting pieces together with silent speed. It was only as we turned onto Oxford Street that he broke the silence. Havisham cannot stay hidden much longer, not with so many threads converging. He has moved with cunning, yes, but not without pride, and pride, Watson, is always a fatal flaw. And Ellis? I asked. You believe he was telling the truth at last? Mostly, but not entirely. His loyalty clouded his judgment. He believes himself noble for protecting Sir Reginald's name, but in truth, he has protected the man's greatest mistake, and possibly his killer. Back at Baker Street, Holmes went directly to the writing table and retrieved the letter we had read at Marchmont House, the one Henry Havisham had sent. He laid it beside the solicitor's draft will and studied the handwriting. Then he retrieved another slip of paper from his files. "This," he said, passing it to me, "is a note I acquired some years ago during an investigation into counterfeit inheritance claims. The man used the name Henry Martin. He attempted to assert himself as heir to a minor Sussex estate, failed, and vanished. Look closely at the signature." I held the note next to the Havisham letter. The penmanship was not identical, but the loops in the H, the trailing N, the angular R, they were undeniably similar. "You believe he's done this before?" I said. "He's spent years weaving identities," Holmes replied. "And in each case, he's lacked the one thing that could validate his claims: proof. But with Sir Reginald dead and the signet ring in his possession, he has, in his eyes, taken what was denied him." There was a knock at the door, and Holmes sprang up to answer it himself. It was Tibbs the informant, short, sharp-eyed, and winded from haste. "Got your man, Mr. Holmes," he said. "Havisham's in Clerkenwell, rents a room under the name Hawes, keeps to himself, comes and goes late, limp in his left leg just as described." Holmes gave a satisfied nod. "Excellent. Keep watching the house. If he leaves, follow him. Send word immediately. Watson and I will visit him tonight." Tibbs departed, and Holmes returned to the fire, eyes glittering. "Clerkenwell," he murmured. "He's chosen an area where the shadows are thickest, where truth and identity blur, but even shadows cast shapes. That evening, with the fog rolling low over the
city like a rising tide, we arrived in Clerkenwell, where crooked lanes and half-lit alleys seemed to whisper secrets to the darkness. Tibbs met us near a butcher's yard and led us by side streets to a modest lodging house, its windows shuttered and a single lamp flickering within. Holmes surveyed the building. "He's home," Tibbs whispered. "Came in an hour ago. No sign of him leaving since." Holmes turned to me. "We go in quietly. If he's cornered, he may react violently. Be ready." The landlady, a timid woman who wrung her hands at the mention of police, let us in with reluctance. "Top floor?" she whispered. "Name of Hawes. Don't want no trouble, gentlemen." Holmes led the way, each step up the narrow stairs creaking beneath our weight. At the final landing, he paused and tilted his head, listening. Then he raised his hand and knocked. 3 sharp raps. There was no answer. He knocked again. Still nothing. Without a word, Holmes crouched and produced a small tool from his coat. In moments, he had the lock unlatched. He opened the door slowly and stepped inside. The room was dim, lit only by a dying fire. It was sparsely furnished, a cot, a desk, a trunk. But on the desk lay the unmistakable glint of gold, a signet ring. Holmes crossed the room swiftly, picked it up, and examined the engraving. "The Marchmont seal," he confirmed. "This alone links him to the study on the night of the murder." I had just begun to search the trunk when Holmes raised a hand. "Listen." Footsteps on the stairs. Holmes moved fast, positioning himself behind the door. I stepped back into the shadows. The footsteps stopped outside. The handle turned. Slowly the door creaked open. A tall, lean man entered, limping slightly. He closed the door behind him and froze as he saw me. But before he could speak, Holmes stepped out from behind the door. "Mr. Havisham," he said quietly. The man's eyes flicked between us, calculating. "You're trespassing." "You're a murderer," Holmes replied. The man smiled faintly. "Is that what they're saying now, that Reginald Marchmont was murdered? How convenient." "No," Holmes said, voice cold and precise. What is convenient is your disappearance after the night in question, your forged identities, your failed inheritance claims, your history, and this, he held up the ring, which was stolen from the hand of a dead man. Havisham's smile thinned. It wasn't murder. Holmes's eyes sharpened. Then what was it? The man's voice grew harsh. He lied. My whole life was a lie because of him. He let me grow up in poverty, in shame. And when I found him, he offered me money as if that made it right. I didn't come to kill him. I came to claim what was mine. But something went wrong, I said. He refused to sign the papers, Havisham said bitterly. He said he'd never acknowledge me, that he'd rather.
See it all burn. We struggled. I didn't strike him hard, just once. He collapsed. I thought he was bluffing, but then he didn't move. Holmes nodded slowly. And so you took the ring, burned the papers, fled. Havisham stared at the fire. I didn't mean for him to die. But you meant to take everything, Holmes said. And that, Mr. Havisham, is what damns you. As Holmes finished speaking, 2 uniformed constables entered. Tibbs had fetched them from the nearby station per Holmes's arrangement. Havisham offered no resistance. He merely stood, shoulders straight, and followed them down the stairs without a word. When we returned to Baker Street that night, Holmes poured us each a drink and sat down at last, looking weary but satisfied. He was a man forged from resentment, he said, denied legitimacy by birth and corrupted by that denial. A tragedy, Watson, but not a justification. I raised my glass. To truth, then, however it must be found. Holmes nodded, but his gaze drifted to the fire. And to the past, he murmured, which never remains buried, not even in death. The following morning dawned with a thin grey light, diffused through the usual London mist that clung to Baker Street like a damp shawl. I found Holmes already at his desk, surrounded by a fresh pile of documents, telegram slips, and newspaper clippings. He was studying a folded sheet of parchment with such intense scrutiny that he did not acknowledge me until I had cleared my throat for the second time. I take it the ring alone is insufficient? I asked, seating myself across from him. Holmes glanced up. Insufficient for a motive, perhaps, but not for the method. The constables are content with the confession and the physical evidence, but I am not. I blinked. You believe there's more? He tapped the parchment with one slender finger. Confession, Watson, is not the same as truth. Havisham admitted to striking Sir Reginald, yes, but he claimed it was a single blow and that death was unintended. The post-mortem suggested otherwise, a precise contusion, not random, not chaotic. Moreover, the missing candlestick has yet to be found. Then you think he lied? I think he told the truth, just not all of it. There's a difference. Holmes rose and moved to the window, peering down at the street where the milkman was making his slow rounds. I've sent for Ellis. I expect him shortly. Why? You suspect him again? Holmes didn't answer at once. I suspect only this, that the night of Sir Reginald's death had more than one visitor. Havisham's presence explains the ring and the missing agreement, but not the burn marks on the hearth, nor the precise injury. The struggle Havisham described was desperate, unplanned. But the blow that killed Sir Reginald, it was delivered with intention. There was a knock at the door, and Mrs. Hudson showed Ellis in.
He looked more composed than during our previous meeting, but tension still pulled at the corners of his eyes. Holmes gestured for him to sit. Mr. Ellis, I shall be brief. Henry Havisham has been arrested and charged with the murder of Sir Reginald Marchmont. His confession has been recorded, but I believe there is still a portion of the night unaccounted for. One final hour in which the scene was altered. I believe you returned to the study after Havisham fled." Ellis looked up sharply, his hands clenching. "Sir Reginald was already dead," Holmes went on. "And you found him. Perhaps you had hoped it was a fainting spell, but no, the body was cold, and so you cleaned. You burned the agreement. You wiped the hearth. You locked the door. But what you may not have realized is that by disturbing the scene, you made it too neat, too orderly. That is what caught my attention." Ellis remained silent, staring at the floor. "I do not believe you struck the fatal blow," Holmes continued, "but you knew what Havisham's presence would mean, and you feared for the Marchmont name. You chose to protect it, no matter the consequences." "I owed him everything," Ellis whispered. "Sir Reginald saved me from ruin years ago, gave me purpose, a future. When I saw what had happened, I panicked. If word got out that an illegitimate son had returned to demand recognition, the family's reputation would be torn apart. Lady Eleanor would be ruined. So I acted." Holmes nodded. "That act may cost Havisham his life." Ellis looked up sharply. "He killed him." "Perhaps," Holmes said coolly, "but justice requires clarity, not assumption, and there's one final clarity we must pursue." He opened a drawer and withdrew a small envelope, sealed with wax. "I received this just this morning from a chemist I engaged 2 days ago," Holmes said. "Inside the hearth soot taken from the Marchmont study, traces of a compound were found. Powdered foxglove, digitalis." "Poison?" I said, stunned. "Not exactly," Holmes replied. "Digitalis, when administered carefully, slows the heart and can mimic cardiac arrest. In excess, it becomes fatal. My theory, Watson, is this. Sir Reginald was already weakened by the drug when Havisham confronted him. The argument turned physical, yes, but the fatal blow, it may not have been fatal at all. It may have only appeared to be. The true cause of death may have been a dose administered earlier." "Earlier?" I said, a chill running through me. "By whom?" Holmes turned to Ellis. "Lady Eleanor had the opportunity. She brought her husband his tea every evening. Ellis, you told us that yourself. You also told us he grew more withdrawn, more paranoid. Classic signs of cumulative digitalis poisoning." Ellis stiffened. "That's absurd. She adored him." "Perhaps," Holmes said, "but devotion can curdle into resentment, especially if secrets are discovered. It is possible she found the letter from Havisham, perhaps even before her husband had a chance to burn it. A child from another woman. A threat to everything she had built her life upon. Perhaps she decided Sir Reginald had betrayed her, one time too many." Ellis stood abruptly. "No, you're wrong." "Am I? She was the only person other than you with consistent access to Sir Reginald's food and drink. The digitalis was administered in small doses, just enough to weaken, confuse, disorient. Then, when Havisham arrived, the perfect opportunity presented itself. A scuffle, a blow and death. Everyone would assume the confrontation had caused it. And so the murder was pinned on the man with the motive." Ellis sank back into his chair, trembling. Holmes turned away from him and moved to the window once more. "I shall not accuse her without further proof, but I believe we must return to Marchmont House once more. If the poison was given by her hand, she will have kept some trace of it, whether out of guilt or necessity." Ellis said nothing more. That afternoon we returned to Ormond Square. Lady Marchmont received us with the same cool dignity as before, but when Holmes asked to examine the late Sir Reginald's private pantry, her composure faltered. "What exactly are you looking for, Mr. Holmes?" "A bottle, perhaps," Holmes said lightly. "A medicine, a tincture. Something with the faint bitterness of foxglove." "I know nothing of such things," she said, too quickly. Holmes merely nodded and proceeded past her. We searched the pantry, the tea-caddy, and a locked cabinet beneath the serving shelf. It was there that Holmes found it, a small glass vial, unmarked but unmistakable. He held it up to the light. "Digitalis," he murmured. Lady Eleanor was silent. "You may deny it, my lady," Holmes said gently, "but the compound is rare and fatal, and you were the only one with access." She looked at the vial, then at Holmes, and at last her shoulders sagged. "I didn't mean to kill him," she whispered. "I only wanted him weakened, so he would be too frail to meet that man again, too weary to indulge his fantasies of reconciliation. I had spent my life devoted to him, Mr. Holmes, and he repaid me with betrayal. I only wanted him dependent. Mine again." Holmes said nothing. "When I saw him lying there," she said, eyes shining, "I believed Henry had killed him, but I never thought, never, that it might be my doing." I stood, frozen, unsure whether to feel pity or horror. Holmes finally spoke. "The truth rarely gives us comfort, but it gives us clarity." She nodded and turned away. Outside, as the door closed behind us, I asked, "What now?" "She will not be arrested," Holmes said simply. "Not yet, but the facts are recorded. When the time comes, she will face the law." "And Havisham?" "He struck a dying man," Holmes replied. "But he did not murder him. He may yet live to reclaim his name, though not in the way he expected." The mist had thickened again as we walked back into the heart of London, the truth behind us like a shadow reluctantly cast into light. The days that followed passed in a slow, expectant hush, as though London itself were holding its breath. The weather remained overcast, casting a sallow light through the windows of Baker Street, where Holmes paced more than he smoked, a sure sign that the case, though technically resolved, had left some residue of unease behind his otherwise precise conclusions. For my part, I felt the weight of what we had uncovered settle into my thoughts more deeply than usual. There was no sense of triumph, no grand declaration of justice achieved. Havisham remained in custody, awaiting the Crown's decision on whether manslaughter or wrongful accusation would be pursued. Lady Marchmont, though not yet charged, had withdrawn entirely from public life, her staff reduced to a single maid, and Ellis, who remained her only companion, silent and watchful. It was on the third morning after our return from Ormond Square that a small envelope arrived, hand-delivered by an unfamiliar page. Holmes opened it wordlessly and handed it to me. The writing was fine, angular, unmistakably feminine. "Mr. Holmes, you have taken from me the illusion that sustained the last years of my marriage. I do not blame you. Truth, when uncovered, is neither cruel nor kind. It is only final. I ask one thing, that you not allow Henry to wear my husband's ring. Let what is buried remain so. Let the past remain a lesson, not a legacy." E.M., I read the letter twice before folding it slowly. "She's not asking for justice," I said. "She's asking for silence." "She's asking for mercy," Holmes replied. "A mercy she herself did not extend when she dosed her husband with poison. It is not my place to grant it." "But you don't intend to report her?" "I have already reported the facts. Whether the authorities choose to act upon them is another matter entirely." He rose and crossed to the mantelpiece, where the Marchmont ring now rested in a small velvet box. It had been recovered from Havisham's lodgings, returned without ceremony to Holmes once the police had completed their examination. Holmes stared at it a moment before speaking. "The irony is that this ring, more than any written proof, might have granted Henry the very legitimacy he spent his life chasing, and yet it became the instrument of his undoing." "He never stood a chance," I murmured. "No," Holmes agreed. "He was born into the wrong story and tried to write himself into one that would not accept him." He snapped the box shut and tucked it into a drawer. That particular fiction is over, but there remains one last matter I intend to address. I looked up. What's that? The origin of the digitalis. But we found the vial in her cabinet. Indeed. But where did she acquire it? Digitalis is not sold freely, not in that form. It must have come from someone who understood its potency and its obscurity. You believe someone supplied it deliberately? I believe Lady Marchmont is not as solitary in her guilt as she appears. And so, later that day, we found ourselves once again tracing threads, this time among the city's apothecaries, a network Holmes knew well. He carried with him the vial in question, now half-filled and bearing no label, and presented it discreetly to 3 different chemists under pretence of inquiry. The fourth, a narrow-eyed man named Finch, who kept a shop on Fleet Lane, showed a flicker of recognition. "That was part of a small batch I sold," he said cautiously. "Special order, prepared about 2 months ago, tincture strength, not for general use." "Who was the client?" Holmes asked. Finch hesitated. "A gentleman. Tall, dark coat, polite. Said it was for a botanical experiment. I didn't ask questions." Holmes leaned forward. "Did he limp?" Finch blinked, then nodded slowly. "Yes, left side, limped as he walked out, now that you mention it." Outside the shop, Holmes drew a sharp breath. "It wasn't Lady Marchmont," he said. "It was Havisham." "But she admitted to using it, but she believed her husband would survive the dosing. Havisham, however, procured the poison. This changes everything." A new timeline unfolded before us, one far more intricate than the one we had first constructed. Havisham had arrived in London with a plan not only to confront Sir Reginald, but to control the outcome of that confrontation. The digitalis had been meant to compromise Sir Reginald's faculties, to weaken him, slow him, perhaps kill him quietly. But Lady Marchmont, discovering the effects, had simply appropriated the plan to her own ends. They had both poisoned him, independently. I turned to Holmes, stunned. "Do we tell the police?" He shook his head. "No, we revise the report, and we request leniency. Havisham's intent may have been premeditated, but the blow he struck was not the one that killed. If anything, it delayed the inevitable." "And Lady Marchmont?" "She delivered a poison she did not understand, for motives she half admitted to herself. I doubt the Crown will see it as murder, but it will end her." As we returned to Baker Street, Holmes's energy seemed to deflate. He moved slowly, each step a shade more thoughtful, less precise. He dropped into his chair with a sigh and steepled his fingers. "This, Watson," he said at last, "was not a case of villains and justice. It was a tragedy of inheritance, of blood and burden. No one walks away clean." I could only nod. For all the satisfaction our solutions sometimes provided, this one left behind a silence that not even Holmes's brilliance could dispel. The days wore on with a strange stillness in the air, as if the very atmosphere had absorbed something from the Marchmont affair, some residue of betrayal and bitterness that left the parlour of Baker Street colder than usual, despite the embers Holmes dutifully stirred each morning. He was quiet, though not idle, turning again and again to the evidence, the letters, the sequence of interviews, as though the pieces, once reassembled, might yield something further, something he had missed. I watched him for a time on the 4th morning, as he leaned back in his chair, the Marchmont ring resting again in its velvet case, unopened, on the mantel. At last he spoke without lifting his gaze from the ceiling. "Something still troubles me, Watson." I set down my tea. "Only one thing?" Holmes's lips twitched in a shadow of amusement. "You recall Finch, the chemist in Fleet Lane?" "Of course. He confirmed that Havisham purchased the digitalis." "Yes, and yet he described the purchaser as polite, deliberate, even courteous. That does not align with the man we met in Clerkenwell. Havisham, for all his eloquence, was desperate, frayed at the edges, the kind of man who broods in dim rooms and spits contempt at the very mention of his father's name. But the man Finch described, calculated, collected, confident. You believe it wasn't him? I believe Finch saw someone else. He rose then abruptly and fetched from his drawer the small folder of case notes he kept at arm's reach during open investigations. From it he removed the first letter, the one Ellis had read to us, the note that had first linked Havisham to the crime. He handed it to me, then produced a second piece of paper. This, he said, was penned by Havisham while in custody. A request to see a solicitor. I examined both. The differences are slight, I said after a moment. But they're there. The loops on the G, the pressure on the downward strokes. You're right. They're not from the same hand. Holmes nodded. Havisham may have threatened Reginald, may have struck him. But he did not write that letter, nor did he obtain the poison. Someone impersonated him. I stared at him. But who? He was already pulling on his coat. Ellis, he said grimly. We must speak to him one last time. Ormond Square greeted us with the same stately stillness as before, but there was a watchful air now to its windows, curtains parted by unseen fingers, eyes that vanished when glanced toward. The Marchmont name was beginning to dissolve into gossip and scandal, and that kind of decay always bred silence. Ellis received us in the front salon. His manner was deferential, but there was a guardedness now, an inward tightness, as though he knew the reprieve Holmes had granted him might yet be revoked. Holmes wasted no time. Mr. Ellis, he said, I must ask you to consider your answers carefully. The letter you brought to our attention, the threat signed H, was not written by Henry Havisham. Ellis blinked. I don't understand. I think you do, and I think the time has come to speak the final truth. For a moment, Ellis said nothing. Then, slowly, he moved to the sideboard and poured himself a small glass of brandy. He did not drink it. He merely held it, as though anchoring himself to something solid. I forged the letter, he said quietly. I thought you might suspect. Watson and I exchanged a glance. Holmes remained motionless. You said Havisham had threatened your master, Holmes prompted. He had, twice, in person. But there were no letters, nothing I could show Lady Marchmont to make her see what I feared. And what was it you feared, Ellis? That Sir Reginald would give in, that he'd name the boy in a will, acknowledge him publicly, that he'd drag the Marchmont name through scandal, through disgrace. He spoke of it, you know. He was torn, half wanted to atone, half wanted to forget. But I saw it coming, so I created a letter, one that would frighten Lady Marchmont, push her to intervene. Intervene by poisoning her husband? Holmes asked coldly. Ellis shook his head. No, I didn't know she'd go so far. I only thought she'd stop him from seeing Havisham. I thought she would take back control. Holmes was silent for a long moment. You bought the poison, he said at last. Ellis's expression didn't change. Yes. You told the chemist it was for a botanical experiment. I knew Havisham had a limp. It wasn't difficult to feign one. I never imagined the chemist would remember so clearly. You intended to use the poison? I intended to weaken Sir Reginald, to make him forget Havisham, to confuse him, keep him close to home. It would have been harmless in small doses. But then Lady Marchmont took over his evening tea. I never imagined she would continue the dosing, not until... It was too late. You passed the vial to her?" Ellis closed his eyes. I told her it was a calming draught. Something to help him sleep. She never asked what was in it. There was silence, a heavy one. I finally asked, "Why not tell the truth, Ellis? After the death, why involve Havisham at all?" "Because I panicked," he said, eyes still closed. "Because I saw in Havisham the perfect scapegoat. He had threatened Sir Reginald. He had visited that night. He had struck him. All I had to do was burn the letter and wait for Holmes to follow the trail." Holmes turned away and walked to the window. The light outside had dimmed, and faint snow was beginning to fall, swirling white against the slate sky. "I must turn this over to the authorities," he said at last. "They may view your role as accessory, perhaps worse, but I will ensure they know the full shape of the matter." El Gildig Somobitswaid nodded once. There was no defiance in him, only the bleak calm of a man who had held back a tide until it drowned him. As we stepped back out into the cold, Holmes walked in silence until we reached the cab. Only as we climbed inside did he speak, his voice low and tired. "3 people poisoned one man, Watson, 1 with a tincture, 1 with a lie, and 1 with silence." We rode back to Baker Street through the snow, the city vanishing in white fog behind us, the case all but closed, and yet Holmes looked out the window as though watching for something that still had not come. The snow had thickened by the time we returned to Baker Street, the city muffled beneath its white coat. The usual cries of newsboys and carriage wheels on stone were silenced beneath the soft accumulation. Inside, Mrs. Hudson had left a fire burning for us, and Holmes stood before it for several minutes without removing his coat, his eyes fixed on the shifting orange flames as if they might yield a final truth not yet spoken aloud. I poured tea, though I doubted he would drink it. "You don't believe it's over?" I said quietly. He gave no immediate reply. Then at last, "It should be over." He shed his coat and settled into his chair, steepling his fingers. "We have the whole narrative now, or at least the appearances of one, a forged letter, a misdirected vial, a blow from a son, the slow decay from a wife. And Ellis, the butler, who thought he could keep it all contained, a neat constellation of guilt. And yet," I said, "you still feel something is missing." He turned his gaze toward the window, where snowflakes fell steadily past the gaslight. "Only one thing troubles me now," he said. "Lady Marchmont." She confessed. She admitted to giving her husband a draught after she learned of the illegitimate son, but Finch said the poison was acquired nearly 2 months before the death. 2 months, Watson. And in that time, Reginald's behaviour did not change suddenly, but gradually, his paranoia, his isolation, as if a process had already begun before the letter, before the confrontation, before the confession. Ellis said he gave her the vial after forging the letter, but the timeline no longer fits. "You think she already had the poison before Ellis came to her?" "I think she may have sought it herself." A knock at the door interrupted us. Holmes, still deep in thought, gestured for me to answer it. It was Tibbs, wrapped in a long coat, his hair damp with melting snow. "Begging your pardon, Mr. Holmes," he said, shifting on the threshold, "but I thought you'd want to see this." He produced a folded sheet of newspaper, the Globe, and handed it to Holmes, who opened it and skimmed its contents with a sharp eye. I read over his shoulder. "Yesterday, Lady Eleanor Marchmont was taken into private care at her family's estate in Surrey, citing illness and nervous strain following the tragic death of her husband. A physician has advised extended isolation and treatment. No visitors are permitted." Holmes folded the paper without comment and stared into the fire again. "She's retreating," he said. "Or escaping," I added. He nodded once. "Which makes now the only moment we'll have to settle the matter properly." That afternoon we took a train to Surrey, the landscape drifting past us in pale, blurred greys. Lady Marchmont's family estate, Hawthorne Grange, was a long, low building wrapped in ivy and silence, the sort of ancestral home where secrets might live for generations without drawing breath. We were met at the door by a thin man who introduced himself as Dr. Willard, the attending physician. "Her ladyship is not receiving callers," he said. "She is unwell, mentally and physically." Holmes offered him a long, unreadable look. "We require only 5 minutes. It's a matter of law. You may remain in the room if you wish." Something in Holmes's tone, cool and unquestioning, moved the doctor aside, and moments later we were ushered into a dim chamber lined with heavy curtains. Lady Marchmont sat in a high-backed chair beside the fire. She looked thinner than before, her complexion pale, her eyes hollow. But when she saw Holmes, something flickered there, something too sharp to be grief. "You've come to see me fall apart," she said. "No, Lady Marchmont," Holmes replied. "I've come to see you complete the truth." She said nothing. "You claimed Ellis gave you the vial after he forged the letter, that you used it to weaken your husband in response to the threat from Havisham, but the records and Sir Reginald's symptoms suggest the poisoning began before that, before Ellis acted." Still she said nothing. "You sought out the digitalis yourself," Holmes went on, "not to protect the Marchmont name, not in reaction to betrayal, but in preparation. The betrayal was already known to you." Her voice, when it came, was brittle. "He told me, a year ago, about India, about the boy, about his guilt." "Why keep silent?" "Because I thought I could bear it. Because I thought it would pass." Her eyes fixed on the fire. "But it didn't pass. He began writing letters, drafting legal documents, speaking in low tones to the solicitor, planning a change to his will." I saw it in his eyes, not regret, resolution. He was going to hand our life to a stranger. "And so you began to poison him." She nodded slowly. "At first I thought it might only dull his senses, diminish his will, keep him close, but it became easier. He grew more forgetful, more erratic. I told myself it was fate, nature catching up, but I measured every drop. You stopped administering it when Ellis offered the vial," Holmes said. "Yes, it felt poetic, that I could step aside, that he might take the blame, that fate had finally intervened for me." Holmes leaned forward. "Did you know Havisham would come?" "I suspected. Reginald spoke of a meeting. I asked Ellis not to interfere. I wanted him to see what his legacy had become." I could feel a chill settle deeper in the room than the snow outside could ever bring. Holmes stood, his face unreadable. "I cannot unlearn what I now know. I will record it, as I must. But whether the law acts, that will be up to others." Lady Marchmont did not look at him. "Let it be over," she said. "We left her there by the fire in her ancestral home, where no one would ever speak of the word murder, though its presence hung in every corner. On the train back to London, the silence between us felt heavier than the wheels beneath us. "She did not kill out of hatred," I said finally. "No," Holmes replied, "but she killed all the same." He turned to look out the window. The snow had stopped, and the clouds had begun to break, just slightly, as though the city itself were sighing in relief. "3 hands reached for control," he murmured, "and none of them won." The train pulled into Victoria Station just past dusk, and London greeted us with its familiar mixture of soot and gaslight, the city already shrugging off the snow as carriages once more rattled along the thawing cobblestones. Holmes stepped down from the carriage without a word, his expression distant but not unreadable. I had seen that particular quiet in him before, not the silence of uncertainty, but of completion, a grim acknowledgement that a puzzle, once solved, does not always bring relief. We took a cab back to Baker Street, the streets blurring past in wet grey streaks. Inside, the warmth of our rooms wrapped around us like a waiting cloak. Holmes immediately crossed to the fire, removed his gloves and stood, motionless before it, his back straight and still, as though absorbing the heat into thought. "You will write this one up, won't you, Watson?" he said after a long pause. "I will," I said, "though I doubt it will make for one of your more triumphant records." "It was never a contest," he said flatly. "Not this time." He sat then, slowly, with the air of a man lowering himself into memory. There were no true villains in this case, only people cornered by consequence, each acting in the name of something they believed righteous, legacy, loyalty, survival, but none with clean hands. "And yet someone must pay," I said. "That is the law." Holmes tilted his head toward the fire. "Perhaps. But if the law punishes them all, who will be left to carry forward what remains?" That question hung between us for several minutes before he rose again and crossed to the drawer where he had stored the Marchmont ring. He opened the box and held the ring in the palm of his hand, the gold band catching the firelight. "This was meant to symbolize lineage," he said. "But instead it bore witness to betrayal, silence, and the slow corrosion of truth, a relic of inheritance that poisoned everyone who touched it. What will you do with it?" He turned it over between his fingers. "I shall return it to the Marchmont estate. Let it rest with the name it represents, whatever that name means now." He placed the ring gently back in its box and sealed it with wax. I reached for my notes, thumbing through the pages, now full with accounts of poison, forged letters, misdirection, and layered guilt. There was a heaviness to the story, and as I prepared to draft its conclusion, I found myself hesitating. "There was a moment," I said, "when I believed Havisham would be the central figure in all this, that he would be the engine behind the crime." Holmes nodded. "As did I, but he was only the spark. The flame had long since been lit." "And Lady Marchmont?" "She administered the doses over weeks, perhaps with confused intent, perhaps with none, but the effect was deliberate. Her crime is the one that wears the least visible stain, and yet—" He trailed off. "And Ellis?" I pressed. Holmes allowed himself a dry smile. "Ah, Ellis, the butler who played a puppeteer. He wanted so badly to protect his master's name that he twisted every lever available. Lies, silence, manipulation. A lesser man might have struck the fatal blow himself if it guaranteed the Marchmont legacy would endure unsullied. But in the end, he too was undone by the very legacy he sought to preserve. The next day, Holmes delivered the sealed box to a discreet courier and instructed that it be taken to Ormond Square with no note, no explanation. The ring, once more in the hands of its bloodline, however fractured, was Holmes's final gesture in the matter. He had no desire to see it again. A week passed, and life on Baker Street resumed its customary rhythm. Cases from the countryside, telegrams from Scotland Yard, the occasional late-night caller seeking Holmes's help in matters ranging from jewel theft to missing manuscripts. But nothing in those days quite captured his attention. He was courteous but disengaged, thoughtful but subdued. He took to the violin more often than usual, and I frequently heard him play long, wandering melodies with no discernible rhythm, pieces that never quite reached their end. It was only a full fortnight later that something changed. A letter arrived addressed to Holmes in a fine, precise hand. He opened it with the casual indifference he reserved for correspondence from the public, but as he read, I saw his brow lift just slightly. He handed it to me without comment, Mr. Holmes, you returned the ring without question, as you said you would. For that, I thank you. Ellis has left my service. He said nothing upon departure, which in truth was the kindest gift he could offer me. I do not expect this note to make the record, but I feel you should know. I am leaving England. There is nothing for me here. I will not say I regret what I did, but I do grieve it. He was my husband, and despite all that followed, I did love him once. Eleanor Marchmont. I folded the letter slowly and set it aside. Will you include this in your final account? Holmes asked, eyes sharp once more. I will mention it, I said. But I will not quote her directly. He nodded once. And what of Havisham? I asked. He will be released, Holmes said. There is sufficient cause now. His confession has been revised, the chemist's account noted, and Ellis's involvement submitted to the authorities. Havisham struck a dying man, but he did not kill him. The courts will see reason. He may still try to claim the Marchmont name. He may, Holmes replied. But I suspect he will not. That ring, returned without explanation, will speak more to him than any judge ever could. Some inherit estates, Watson. Others inherit burdens. That night, as I sat drafting the closing lines of the case, Holmes stood at the window, pipe in hand, looking out over the flickering gaslights of Baker Street. Snow no longer fell. The air was cold but clear. And though the mystery of the Marchmont affair had reached its end, its shadows lingered, in the corners of memory, in the hollow of names left behind. He turned to me only once before retreating to his room. "Write it well, Watson," he said, "but do not let the reader believe this was a victory. There are no victors in a story like this, only survivors." And with that, he closed the door behind him, leaving the fire to burn low in the grate and the truth, now written, to settle into silence. The final days of winter passed without incident, and with the first hint of spring softening the air, I found myself preparing my notes to commit the Marchmont case, at last, and in full, to manuscript. Holmes, though otherwise occupied with a minor case involving a forged violin and a jealous music tutor, sat across from me, lazily turning over a page from the Times as I finalized my final paragraphs. As I reread the account, a singular question returned to my mind, one that had lingered beneath every detail of the investigation, unspoken but persistent. At last, I voiced it aloud. Holmes, if Ellis had not forged the letter, and if Lady Marchmont had never found the will drafts or suspected her husband's intentions, do you believe Sir Reginald would have formally acknowledged Havisham as his heir? Holmes glanced over the edge of the paper. A curious question, Watson, but a worthwhile one. He folded the paper and set it aside, then rose and crossed to the cabinet, where he kept a handful of personal case materials, documents he rarely shared, but occasionally allowed me to review in confidence. From a leather folder, he drew a final item I had not seen before, a letter, sealed and addressed to one Henry Marchmont, postmarked but never sent. "Where did you get this?" I asked, startled. "It was among Sir Reginald's private correspondence," Holmes said. Ellis overlooked it in his haste, and it was later passed to me by the solicitor once the estate's affairs were officially examined. The letter was written 2 days before Sir Reginald's death. He opened it and read aloud, "My dear Henry, you have every right to feel wronged. I have lived with the weight of your existence since the moment I left India, and not a year has passed that I have not wondered what kind of man you became. I know your appearance here is not an act of greed, but of justice. For that reason, I have instructed Mr. Dawes to prepare an amendment to my will. You shall not carry my name in shame any longer. It is time I claimed you as my own. Reginald Marchmont." Holmes handed me the letter, and I read it again in silence. the weight of the words pressing harder than any blow we had seen exchanged during the case. "He was going to do it," I said. "Yes," Holmes said softly, "and he never got the chance." "And no one knew?" "Lady Marchmont suspected, Ellis feared, but only Sir Reginald knew with certainty. And that certainty cost him his life, though not in the way any of them intended." I folded the letter and returned it to him. "Will you send it to Havisham?" Holmes nodded. "Eventually, but not now. His wounds are still fresh, and the Marchmont name carries less meaning to him than the silence it leaves behind. He will come to it in time." We sat quietly for a while, the fire crackling, the rain just beginning to tap gently at the windows. At last, Holmes spoke again. "You asked once if this case lacked a true villain. It did not. The villain was time and the choices it allowed to fester. Regret turned to silence, silence to deceit. And when the past came knocking, no one answered with truth. He took up his violin then and, without prelude, began to play, not one of his typical experimental flourishes, but a low, steady melody. It was a piece I recognized faintly, one rarely performed in concert halls, but mournful and measured like a farewell. I left my notes on the desk and watched as the music filled the room. And when I finally turned back to the last page of the manuscript, I added one final line. In the end, Sherlock Holmes did not unearth a killer, but a slow, buried truth that even in the most distinguished households, it is not always hatred or greed that does the greatest harm, but love, mislaid and misjudged, festering in the quiet corners of pride. I closed the notebook and let the fire burn on.